illustration as being more representative as opposed to being more photogenic. It's just how people are responding to the work in interesting ways. The more photogenic something is, the more liable they are to be threatened by it or reject it. The more abstract it is, the more they are seeing it as part of a conversation. But I was really taken with her illustration style and her rendering style. You can see the trees that are set in the distance are more transparent. Things that are closer to the picture plane or the section cut line are more opaque. So it creates this notion of distance. So just by using opacity, there's a sense of depth being communicated. And this might be drawn in Illustrator. It might be drawn with Apple Pencil. I don't know. But it's she drops in a series of cutouts, probably from her own library. It has a hand-drawn look, but still has a digital feel to it. So I was really taken by her work. Her name is Amy Lagnado, and she's now a practicing landscape architect in Britain. Design Workshop is a large firm with multiple offices across the United States. One of our graduates, Steve Spears, works in the Austin office, and Rebecca Leonard is one of our MERP alumni. She was president of the organization for a brief time. But they have offices in Aspen and Colorado Springs, Denver, Austin, another great multidisciplinary consulting firm if you're interested in private practice, and a firm that does landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning as a consulting service, not a municipality, but as a private consultant. But take a look at their rendering style. What is distinguishable or distinctive about this rendering style that you think could be something to be picked up here, that could be implemented or thought about in an interesting way? What's going on here that speaks to you?
I really like because I know that the things that are closer you should put more detail on.
Yep.
But I like how the things that are further away in the street as well, they grayed out.
Yep.
Because you can still see it, but it's
Right.
very clear that that's not the focus.
Yeah, I would say the built environment is like grayscale, and then the station's color, which is
Yep.
interesting, as well as.
Okay, so there's almost a communication of before and after, in that the existing context is grayed out and the proposed is in full Technicolor. So that way it's already starting to speak as a rendering. This is the before, this is the after. So you can take an existing photograph either from your camera, from a site visit, or from Google Street View, bring it in and start to collage over it, and start to bring things into the foreground. Notice how the original photograph or the original Street View is framed, and then there's a buildup of foreground elements that are actually coming forward towards the viewer, and it gives a very interesting edge to the entire rendering. So it's a technique, collage style technique of manipulating the foreground. I want you to really think about and try in your own work. But it's a great way of very clearly communicating proposed versus existing because the existing context is grayed out. So another one of their renderings, this is in Iowa City, great college town. I encourage all of you to visit it sometime as soon as the virus stops destroying Iowa. But at any rate, great college town, home of University of Iowa. But they wanted to do an alley study to create some connectivity between their nightclubs and restaurants. So this is a collage over that. There's some Photoshop effects. There's some cast shadows. These are all cut out people. There's some lighting effects with the airbrush. There's this image, of laying on some additional urban art, graffiti, roof terraces, stuff like that. So, and then they've laid in a green pavement as a texture, stretched it. You can see the brick pavement on the right is just another texture laid on and then stretched. So all those tools I was showing you last week, the free transform, the skew, the distort, the perspective tools in Photoshop, you can bring in a lot of these cutout things and then start to stretch and place them in to the image. And probably a little bit of a blue haze laid over it with some additional Photoshop brushes or airbrushing effect to create these lighting effects. So very distinctive before and after image, but you can still see the elements from the before clearly as you move into the after. Taking photos right at dusk is really nice because the sky makes that brilliant cobalt blue. Okay, this is just when the sun sets, so it's a great time to take photographs to set up for night renderings. Another simple rendering style. Let me click through these. This was a Polish example that I showed you, I think at the beginning of the class, but distinctive. So what's different or distinctive about this style? Different from what we've seen.
The buildings are yellow.
They're quite yellow, yeah. Yeah.
Um,
What about, where's the existing building? Do you see it there?
Is it the one that actually has color on it?
Yeah, yeah. So that's the existing building in the background. Okay. This is proposed. Can you see the existing buildings in the background here? And okay. All right, so a deliberate choice to make the proposed buildings really, really warm, very inviting, popped, okay? So this was either SketchUp or Rhino model, exported, and then colored in Illustrator. Each of those panels then just becomes a different color cell or a different color group. Or potentially, they were using the styles menu in SketchUp to export one of the color styles or one of the color sets to get sort of a pop art kind of feel or look to their massing as they exported it. And then we either used existing photographs or Google Street View to mesh it into the context, so that they have cutout of an existing building in that distance there. So that's another collaging technique that you can bring in existing context either from a Google Street View or from your own photographs. Textures for the foreground, you can see just stretched textures for the brick pavers. Cut out people as silhouettes. Now, what do you think about that? Do you like people to be fully dressed, fully colored, fully represented, or do you prefer silhouettes? What's the thinking behind silhouettes versus full dress? What do you think?
I think it depends what you want to focus on.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, this makes me want to focus more on the buildings.
Okay, right. So the focus isn't on the people. We know they're there. The focus isn't on them, what they're wearing, what they're doing. Aha. So that could be a strategy in the communication. So instead of obsessing whether or not your scale figure is wearing Gucci or Donna Karan, or what they represent or where they represent, the silhouette just takes all that away. So we're not obsessing about what they're wearing. We're not identifying race or ethnicity. We're just seeing them as a scale figure. Okay, that's important because if you remove that from the conversation, the viewer doesn't focus on it. Okay, they focus on the proposal of the streetscape and of the infill, not what they're wearing. What about foreground? What kind of foreground tricks are being done here? The lighting. What about the grass that's in the foreground in the lower right? It's done as a cutout, right? So it creates a framing element or a foreground element by just cutting out from the color as opposed to showing the grass as a plant. It's another way to start thinking about foreground elements and how you can frame things out. Everything else is also a cutout. Those are all cutout plants just placed in from a library. The overhead lighting is just Photoshop brush. It's just an airbrush. So it's a way of collaging all this information, but it's still communicating a lot of stuff. What it's not communicating is the architecture, because the architecture isn't part of the conversation yet. It's just the massing, it's just the idea we want some infill here. That it might have some storefronts and it might have some upper floor housing. That's it. We're not talking about picking colors or trim details or window styles. We're just talking about infill and livable streets. That's where the planner, the urban designer exists, right? We're not there yet. We're not obsessing over architecture. We're just making a proposal for some infill in this district, and this is how it can enliven that district. So it keeps the conversation focused, it keeps the conversation limited, and keeps the public from obsessing over details that don't matter yet. Okay? But, lighting, cars, paving, seating, trees, and the existing buildings are still visible. What about the sky? What's different about these skies?
realistic, but they're also muted.
Yeah, you're grayed out or they're muted down to 10, 20%. It's not a brilliant blue cobalt sky, it's just enough. Maybe 10 or 20%, that's it. Again, so the focus goes to the middle ground and to the foreground as opposed to the background. All about focus, okay? Do we see those themes? Are those keying in now? Starting to come together? Okay. I was really taken by this example, so. Another guidebook, if you're interested in design for distancing, social distancing, and businesses being able to survive in more street space, there's a wonderful guidebook out of Baltimore that came out of a design competition, and I was taken by the simplicity and the pop art quality of their renderings. So do check out that guidebook that is available at designfordistancing.org. Other things to follow on Instagram, if you start following the hashtags tactical urbanism, placemaking, streets for people, change your street, project for public spaces, all great accounts to follow and all great hashtags to follow, give you an idea of some of the transformative work that's happening right now, helping small businesses and restaurants survive the pandemic, and how New York City in particular is going to allow permanent outdoor seating now, as opposed to just temporary. That's an example that just happened in the last couple of days. So a lot of meaningful work happening out there in terms of helping folks survive this pandemic and stay in business. New York Times, a couple of weeks ago in July, more than a couple of weeks ago, had a wonderful op-ed called I've Seen a Future Without Cars, and it's amazing. PAU Studio, Project for Architecture and Urbanism Studio, is a multidisciplinary office out of New York that did a series of renderings, before and after renderings, using primarily Google Street View to show a distinctive before and after proposal for pedestrianizing a good portion of Manhattan. It doesn't mean removing cars entirely. It means that utility vehicles, delivery vehicles, trash, and those sorts of things can still access the majority of these smaller side streets in New York City, but it means that banning private cars from them would yield a heck of a lot more space for alternative transportation, child space, elder space, and trash space. Because in Manhattan and in the 5 boroughs, trash delivery is made at the street because there aren't any alleys. What is the biggest difference between New York and Chicago? It's the food, it's the accent, and it's the trash. Because in Chicago, all the trash is at the alley, because there were alleys planned, because Daniel Burnham put them into the 100-year plan. He put them into the plan so that all those utilities were at the back of the property, not the front. It makes a huge difference in the aesthetics of the city. And in New York, this is a big debate because the image of New York is one of having a lot of trash on the sidewalk. That would change all that, because if you eliminate the private car from a majority of these side streets, primarily residential streets in Manhattan, it frees up that for centralized garbage and recycling collection. But I thought it was interesting how they put these renderings together. These are all from cutouts. So these are cutout textures, these are cutout people, these are cutout objects, and they're brilliantly photoshopped together almost seamlessly, even though this is a Google Street View. Now, what is distinctive of a Google Street View versus a photograph? What is the biggest difference between a Google Street View image and a photograph that you take? Yeah.
Is it distortion? Like the distortion?
It is parallax distortion. It's from the lens. Yes, that's a good answer. It's correct. Wasn't what I was looking for, but it's correct. Yeah.
Is it the angle of view?
The angle of view or the height of where the camera is set. Yes. 2 correct answers. Okay. So you are 5'7", 5'8", 6'1". If you hold up a camera to your face, you are approximately 5'2", 5'3", from ground to where the lens is. So therefore, your horizon line is at 5'2", 5'3", and you are at eye level with another person who's standing there. But you're also at eye level with the top of the car. You can't see a building through a car. So Google Street View mounted a camera about 7.5 feet above the ground. It's a 4-door sedan, tiny little car, big honking camera on top. They mounted it at 7.5 feet so they could see over parked cars and then be able to see the real estate. They did that on purpose. So if you're using Google Street View to create a perspective, you have to set your horizon line higher. Not lower, but higher. And we can see that. We have that ability to see over the parked car. That is the difference. So when you put people in, see where the horizon line is? It's higher. You're actually looking down a little bit on them. So you notice the horizon line is running right through the middle of the image, and that folks are positioned below it, not at the horizon line as if it were a regular photograph. They are below the horizon line because it is a Google Street View. So important distinctions as you set these things up. Steve Price, another great practitioner of this type of imagery, he uses the GIF. GIF? 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 Anyway, CompuServe came up with the GIF back in the 90s, graphic image format. It is interesting because it is an image that can be animated, or when loaded to a web browser can walk through a stage of images. These are all from cutouts: buildings, cars, trees, lighting, people, and he does these stunning befores and afters just from having an extensive Photoshop cutout library. But with these images, he's able to show phased construction, phased development, phased construction. And that's why he can charge what he charges for these images. He also charges for them. So some of them thousands of dollars. But he has built this huge cutout library for his practice, including buildings, including trees, all that. So he's able to show phased development or phased construction. The GIF or the GIF may very well become an image that you will use in your time. Okay, it's a little past me. I will eventually learn how to make one, but more and more folks in architecture and landscape architecture are starting to use animations in their presentations, and so you very well may find yourself in a position to communicate phase development or phase construction using a GIF, which is interesting because it's one of the oldest internet image formats we have. But it's survived. I mean, it's been around for 25 years or so. It still works. Another blog called Show It Better. They have a web page, a YouTube channel, and examples on their Instagram. This is a small business in that they charge for their courses, but they have a lot of free stuff that they give away in the form of tips and in form of cutout packs or icon packs or Illustrator pieces or textures. So every week they'll have a free giveaway of stuff that you can download and add to your digital library. So it's a good blog to follow, whether it be Instagram or otherwise. They just have different tips every week. Shortcuts, tips, advice, things like that. Primarily addressed to architects, but they also do the collage method, or what we call the post-digital style of rendering, really well. They're one of the few folks that actually takes the viewer through the steps of how to do a really nice collage style rendering, or what we call the post-digital type of representation. Some of my work in the Shred Graphics course and in the community shreds we've done in Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, and the like, some different partial street sections or sidewalk sections or trail sections. I come from a background of comic books and cartooning in 4th to 6th grade, so sometimes I'll even put in stories, people arguing or talking or supporting a different team. This guy's probably a Cardinals fan, sitting there. But I do still have a very loose approach to my landscape graphics and my people, and so they do attempt to communicate a little bit of a story going through. And there's lots of discussion about how far you take that, but in the Shred Graphics course, we talk about the marker and colored pencil blending methods and techniques of how they can come together to communicate something quickly. Some of my Photoshop work, I actually spec'd some street furniture. I drew it by hand, scanned them in, rendered them in Photoshop, and we started to put together these different packages of planters, trees, and lighting for this city in Connellsville. We were able to locate some great sources for lighting because they were made right there in Pennsylvania. So we were hired, the firm I was with called Studio 3,
which is primarily architecture now, but we were trying to branch out into landscape architecture and urban design. We did some urban design guidelines for this small town outside of Pittsburgh. So just using that same cutout mentality of building up a library of PNG images of cutouts and starting to group them together into ensembles and then sharing that with the client. They were able then to spec the urban furniture that they wanted directly from our drawings. Other neighborhoods, Southeast Neighborhood Development Association, or CDC and Indy, they were struggling with on-street parking and what to do with limited street width, so I did a series of drawings here that have the plan and the section together, because the two of them together work to communicate specific widths of elements: drive lane, sidewalk, what are called the esplanades in Indianapolis, the boulevards. They call them esplanades. I don't know. I call them boulevards. But in Indianapolis, they are esplanades, and whatever they say is locally is what you do. So they were really struggling with how to accommodate on-street parking and the drive lane. They were just having some problems with these different street widths. So we created a series of plans and sections to show options. This is what happens if you widen the street, leave the esplanade alone, and widen the street. So it means new sidewalks. It means losing some trees. So that was a tough decision. Or you narrow the esplanade. And you can see, a hard decision for the neighborhood to make. But the drawings did help them make a decision in terms of what they prioritized. Did they prioritize the esplanade? Did they prioritize the front yard? Or could they get new sidewalks out of the project? Those kinds of questions. So the drawings helped them make a decision of how to move forward, as opposed to doing nothing, which doing nothing meant that in some cases the parked cars prevented people from the ability to drive by at all. So it was a problem that they needed to solve. But this is the hand technique of laying it out with a T-square or parallel rule and drawing it all by hand. Some other sections I did for my buddy in Nebraska. This is Norwalk, Iowa, doing some corridor studies. Again, the combination of plan and section together. And I've been drawing cars like this for a while now, so but the graphics seem to work. But the labeling is all done in the section. That way you can label exactly what each drive lane does. And then these stream bed or river sections, I showed these to you a couple of weeks ago. Same client, but laid out all in Illustrator with cutout trees. And then sometimes we don't have what we need readily available, but we can actually doctor someone else's image and grab what we need. Sometimes we need to make our own cutouts and strategize to make a new section. This is a section perspective of a stream bed, so I just grabbed a photograph from that area from a different photographer, started to create some cutouts, and then I was able to show the section like so. Do you see where all the pieces came in, including the water? So that way it was context sensitive and context relevant. So this way it looks like a Nebraska river as opposed to an Indiana river. So it does make a difference. So sometimes you have to make your own cutouts, but you can, with the power of Photoshop, you can get away with it. I guess that's the short answer. Let's go to Illustrator. How big should we make it? 24 inches? Hint, if we wanted this to be scaled, what would be something we could do? In the model, you could put a little box that was a scalable element in the model, right? You could put that in the model so that when you export, you have a scalable element, like it's 100 feet or something. Okay. Oh, I love it. My glasses fog up. New. Jeez. Let's do a 24-inch artboard. 300 PPI, just create that. And I'll turn on a grid. I always like to show a grid under View, Grid. And then under Window, Workspace, always make sure you have a painting workspace. It seems to work for us. You might look through the different workspaces, but that was with the issues we were having early on in the class. But the painting workspace seems to work for me. And then we'll place our new PNG. That's really, really small. Jeez. But because we chose it as a portable network graphic, because we chose the transparent side, it meant that we didn't have a big, really small one. So we'll give it some advantage, just in terms of the urban section coming in like so. It comes in on its own layer, so that's ready. Inspect it, make sure it's kosher, make sure the lines are not pixelated. You may need to adjust your model before you export to get things that are looking good. And I think I'll center it here and then lock the selection. That'll lock it so it doesn't move on me. It's on its own layer, so I'll call that the model, or you can call it houses or buildings. Then I'll start building up layers. So I'm going to call this the fill. And the fill for me is probably just going to be a gray box. And I often use a gray box just because I can drop labels into it. I'm going to just bring it down just a little bit, have that be its own layer. That's on its own layer now. That is above where the houses are. Next, I'm going to create another layer and call it the cut line. The cut line is going to be the section, part of the section cut that represents the cut into the earth. And that can be a contoured line, that can be a regular, you can use the pen tool, you can use the curvature tool, whatever you need to use to make your cut line. I'm going to make that the active layer. And then start bringing that in. There isn't a lot of topography on the site, as you know, but there is a little bit of a dip as we go from midpoint and as we go down to the ditch itself. So that's a polyline. I'm going to change the stroke of that. Go to the stroke menu, bump up the weight significantly. Now the houses are sitting on the cut line. Okay. And I move up my cut fill underneath the cut line. And go, well, maybe, maybe the ditch needs to be represented or accounted for. Maybe we instead go to fill, and I'll recreate that with the pen tool. I will recreate the cut line with the pen tool, just so I can have that fill be all nice and gray. And that's sitting underneath the cut line. I may need to adjust my artboard. If I go to Object, Artboards, Fit to Artwork Bounds, it will resize your artboard to that. trying to represent the ditch here. So I probably already made some mistakes. No fill. No fill. No fill. I don't want fill. But I've got a cut line and I've got a fill, just graphically starting to represent the cut of the earth and then the fill below. We can have that as a graphic element, or we can have that as a place where we can put labels. And I'll go back to view, fit artboard and window. The whole thing is now visible. And I can stretch things or add to things as necessary. That looks pretty good. It's representative of your site. Your site has some topography. For the most part, it doesn't happen until the change doesn't happen until the beginning of the floodplain, as we experienced when we were on the site. And then we can start thinking about a sky. If you want a sky, you can create a sky layer and then go into blocks, under the resources folder. I have backgrounds and foregrounds, some site photos, and fields and skies. We could definitely use a site photo here. We could potentially use part of a site photo as a background, or we can use a generic sky. I bought a huge pack of cutouts from someone in Thailand. They were fantastic. They're high resolution photographs, but some of them are very Thailand centric. So there's, okay, so, or you can do what I did and go to Cannon Commons downtown and take pictures of the lawn, take pictures of the sky, and have more Muncie-centered skies, or Muncie-centered grass, or Muncie-centered brick, things of that nature. And just get into the habit when you walk around of taking pictures for future textures, right? Why not? It's already there. So your friends will ask you, why are you taking pictures of the ground? But you end up building up a collection of things that are more appropriate to your context. So go ahead and pick out one of these skies. And place it in. We need to place it on its own layer, and that layer we need to drag that layer to the bottom of the order. And I'll place the sky. It's big, which is good. So even with an iPhone 6, you can get some decent resolution. Of course, with later iPhone models, it just gets better and better every year. Bring that in, put it behind everything else. You don't need to use the whole thing. You might choose to use just a portion of it. You don't want to smoosh it too far. And you don't want that to be so dramatic that it looks like your development is a match made in heaven or a gift from heaven. You do want to tone that down a bit. So we can grab the opacity of the image. We can scale that opacity down. This is 20%, 32%, something like that. And this is why I have that grid showing. That grid is reminding me that I have elements that are translucent and I'm changing the opacity. It's extremely important for me to have that grid on, because now I can tell how opaque something is or how unopaque something is. This section is looking east, so I may elect to take a look at my site photos and see if there's something there in that set that is appropriate because it's looking east. And sure enough, there's my bicycle. I'm looking east in this photograph. So I go to large, So sometimes it's helpful to have a photo blog because it's always there. Save that image. And then think about opening that in Photoshop. So we want to open that site photograph in Photoshop. What's wrong with it, though? There's a number we need to remember. What's wrong with it? What is a number we need to remember? How wide is your section? When you exported it, how wide was it? You put in a number when you export it. Under options. If you follow my directions. I put in 5,000 pixels. So, any background image you bring into this, you want it to be in that realm of pixelation. Otherwise, it's going to come in very, very small. Okay? So that's an option. We could use the sky we have. That sky was pretty good, actually, but at any rate, we want this to be big before we start using it. So this needs to be 5,000 pixels and a reasonable size, or we just need to take better photographs. That's not going to work. That should be linked, so we need to bump that up, get that into the preserve details. You could also do automatic, reduce the noise. So any of our site photographs need to be in the same realm of things that we choose to use. So I could use this sky, but I'm interested primarily in this portion of the photograph. So I'll grab the quick selection tool and start holding down the shift key. I'm just going to start picking up this tree line. This is with the quick selection tool. It's a great time saver. Holding down the shift key, I'm just grabbing these things. Just a little bit of the foreground. Don't need everything. But this is another reason we take site photographs. I will copy that and then go File, New. It will make a new clipboard image. It's 6944. Paste that on there. I'll double click on the background, get rid of that, and this is now ready to become a PNG. But I had to get rid of the background. Save this as, I'll call this tree line. PNG. It's big, which is great. And then I can place that in. I'll make a new layer, tree line. In front of the sky, place Oh. Come on. Save as. Okay. It's not saved yet. That makes sense. I couldn't place it because it wasn't saved yet. Gee. We selected a portion of the site program, marked it, and we cut it out, and bring it in as a PLAN. That way the tree line is relevant to the site. And this is just okay. Now it's saved. My computer's going, woo! Busy, busy, busy hard drive. Okay. Bring that in. It's nice and big, so you don't have to worry about pixelation or that jazz. Scale it down. Relative to what's there. You don't want to get too overboard. Somewhat relative to what's there. And be thinking about your framing of your image as well. You're starting a little bit of a collage look, but this will work. See, I've got a little bit of grass there. It just helps to help illustrate a little bit of tilt, a little bit of curvature of the earth, a little bit of the background. We want our buildings to look tall, not like toys. So we do want to get this in the realm. Maybe squat, a little bit of squat there. And then I'll take the opacity down. Not 100%, not 50%, but I'll look in the realm of a 60, 70%. Okay. See what that does? Starting to look real, it's starting to look like the solar sun. This way your sections, your plan, your perspective, all okay. Then the cut line is on top. Very important. We're going to create a new layer and call it New Trees. Move that below the cut line and maybe below the fill line, but in front of the houses. Understand the layer order. Cut line, fill, new trees, houses, tree line, sky. It's a multi-layer sandwich in terms of how all these different things come together. And then we can we can close out Photoshop. Don't save that. Close that out. Close out SketchUp. Go back to Box. And start grabbing some trees. So go to Resources, Cutouts. We have car cutouts, people, diagramming elements, tree cutouts, people in plan view. So I'll go to Gallery View, adjust the size. We've got 4 pages of trees here, so plenty to go through. We want to pick out trees, foreground trees that work well as street trees in front of our buildings. Start grabbing a couple of these. Download those. Download those. Couple of these. These are nice and big. There's 7 to 8 megs a piece, so they're nice and big. Just in terms of representing a few of the species that we have here. I'm going to go to my active layer, make that New Trees, and start placing some of those. They come in quite big, so you have to scale them down. relative to the size of your existing trees and relative to the size of your buildings. You don't want to overwhelm your buildings per se. Not something you want to do there. Then once you get it scaled, you can copy, paste multiple copies of that same tree scaled appropriately. If you want, you can start changing the opacity of those trees. At 70%, they still look pretty nice. They can start to show depth based on their opacity. Full opacity trees will be closer to the cut line. Thinner opacity trees will be further away from the cut line. But keep them on their own layers so you can always work with it later. And then this is ready for either labeling as an Illustrator document, or it's ready for export, and you would label it then in InDesign. It's your choice in terms of where you choose to label it. If it's a standalone Illustrator document, you would label it here. If it's part of a larger InDesign presentation, you would label it there. Okay. What do you think? Graphically, workflow, how does this look to you? Okay. Good. Okay. And if you wanted to play that foreground trick, you could open up one of these trees in Photoshop. You could try that foreground trick. So I've got the tree here. I'm going to save it. Before I do anything to it, I'm going to save it as a new file name. I'm going to call this Cutout Tree 42 Whiteout. Whiteout. That's going to be a copy. Okay. I'm going to select color range. Oh, sorry. I'm going to, let's see, select subject. I think it'll do it. I think. All right, I selected the subject, and so I will take my paint bucket and some white. I'm in Photoshop now, and dump white. I think that will that gets us there. Or I can white it out with a paintbrush like this. All right, this is a new, you can select the subject and you can isolate the subject of the cutout, whether it be a person or a tree, and start to create some abstraction with this. So this is now saving as what we're going to call a whiteout. Copy, cutout tree whiteout. Make sure I got this saved correctly. To the downloads folder. It's now a white version of that tree. And then, on its own layer, I'm just going to call this foreground. I'm going to place this whiteout tree and get that graphic effect we were after with the example I showed you. And just place this whiteout tree in the foreground. Create a foreground framing element with it. either on the left-hand side or the right or both. It can be an interesting, if you choose, it can be an interesting effect, graphic effect to the rendering. Whether this be a perspective or a section. Maybe move it off to the side a little bit. Let me get this view window. Make sure I can see the whole artboard. Okay. Maybe it works better on the left. Or maybe it's not the right tree. I don't know. Rotate a little bit. But you can white out one of these trees and you can start to create it as a foreground element. Move that up. That can start to become an effect, a framing effect. Readjust these things, get them lined up. Looks like I need to address the ditch. Bring these things together. Maybe bring this over. But that can become a framing element or an artistic addition to your sections that you might find interesting. Or not, but it works. It's that whiteout effect that we saw in the examples. That can be another artistic effect to the picture. All right, now that's ready to save. So we export as. So in Illustrator we have the option to export for screens or export as. We can export it as a PNG or a JPEG. You can use the artboards. However this exports. This is now our section. Cut, store, looking east. I always like to call things looking east, so looking in the direction, not from a direction, but looking in a direction. I just prefer that because it makes more sense to the viewer and just makes more sense in terms of how we would stand on the site and look towards east or west. So this is called section cut store looking east. Export. Background color is transparent. This is where we choose whether or not we want it transparent, white, or black. Black would give you a very different effect, but it could be very cool, depending on what your aesthetic is. I'll export another one. Same thing. Store. I'll just export a couple different things. Use artboards, export, background color white. When we export, we are setting the resolution of this artboard. I'll just export all three, see what they look like. PNG, store, transparent. Okay, let's take a look at them. Desktop is full. It's been a busy day. There's the transparent. There's the white. There's the black. Awful. But it does yield a different focus, right? It makes all the background stuff very, very dark and the foreground stuff more pronounced. But that's the white, and that's the transparent. So this transparent one can be placed on any PowerPoint slide, any colored background, anything. The white is going to have a stark white background, and you can crop it down. You can label it in Illustrator, label it in Design, either way, but the section is ready to go at that point. So that's how you take all these elements and start to put them together in an urban section. Okay?
What's the difference between PNG and JPEG?
JPEG is every pixel has a color, has a value. And it's from image boundary to image boundary, it's all pixels. No transparent background. Portable network graphic, PNG, preserves the transparency around something so you can place it, cut out immediately, onto another background. And if you have things that have less opacity, it preserves that as well. A JPEG flattens everything. It is the smallest file size, it is a compressed file size, and every time you save a JPEG, it denigrates. It is a summary of all of the colors that are in an image. Portable network graphic preserves the transparency or opacity of things. It preserves translucent edges. So you can place that object onto a different background. PowerPoint slide, another illustrative file. It's what we use for cutouts. It's what we use for opacities. It's what we use for masks. It's what we use for textures. So these different file types do yield different things. We're doing on time. 2:30. Take a 10-minute break. Come back and we'll do a perspective. Okay? Similar steps. Okay? But more times we do it, the more times you get it. But does that look like a site section that you can live with? Yes? Good? Good. This helps you move forward. Okay? Okay, 10-minute break.
Do you have a question?
We stop the recording.
Oh, I'll have to take my computer.
Yep. Gotta stop the recording. Styles. Again, you can just look at these through a couple of different lenses. Some of these look pretty well for vignettes or even sketchy looking things. That might be something for us to think about as we move forward and as we start to think about an export for an eye-level perspective. But for now, I'll go back to default styles. I'll probably go back to shaded with textures. And keep in mind, there are folks in the SketchUp world that all they do all day is make new styles or they edit these styles. And so there's a ton of stuff underneath these buttons, the select, the edit, or the mix, where you can actually start modifying these different things: jitter, endpoints, extensions, profiles, back edges. There's a ton of variations right here in the styles menu that folks do start to work with. We had a great guest speaker last year named Devin Levine of Houseo Levine Associates, which is a fantastic consulting firm out of Chicago. He spent 8 hours with us just doing SketchUp training. We have it all on tape. If that floats your boat, if you want to watch 8 hours of SketchUp training beyond what you already have here. But he and his firm have developed their own menus in terms of all these different things that you can look at in the styles. So let's think about this model. Let's get rid of our little sign here. We don't need that anymore. Let's think about what it would be an optimal eye-level perspective for our client. So if we have the position camera, the little person, so we can put our little person walking along Euclid, maybe walking along a path or walking along the river. We're starting to think about something along Euclid here. We need to place him or her somewhere. And we need to have perspective turned on. And we start to see, if we have this little eyeball here, we can start to look around and start to position a general street view. We can grab the feet and we can start to look around and start to walk up the street until we find a fairly optimal view that we're interested in sharing. This is the participatory part of the just kind of tell me what kind of view you want to, we don't want to be inside, but what kind of view would you like to work with? Where would you want to be? Do you want to be along the river, the ditch, or do you want to be on the street? Where do you want to be? Don't all talk at once.
Along the street.
Okay. Sounds good. So let's position our little person maybe on the sidewalk there, and then move the eyeball around for some variety. I've got a couple of different models here, so we might start to think about positioning those with some trees or something like that. There may be changes to the models. And then take us through some of the default styles. This is the X-ray, the hidden line, simple, which has a blue gradient sky. I kind of like the shaded with textures because it doesn't have a sky that actually has it, so it's working for me. But if we look at some of the color sets, this is pretty, very European. This is very nice. Oh man, blue and orange, my goodness. Those are date colors right there. But this might be the settings where that Polish example was going through, and maybe starting to think about something a little more abstract as opposed to something that's more simple. But that can already start to set up some nice things for the model, depending on what the model is painted, depending on what your models are. If they're white like this, this could become a very, very nice abstract way of approaching the project. But for now, I'm going to stay in default. I'm going to go for shaded with textures because it's going to give us a no sky example. So this is ready for export. Or if there are some things you want to take care of here, there may be and maybe some adjustments to be made at this point. These are all components, so I don't want to mess with them right now. But this might be, I think we're good. I think we're all right in terms of setting this up for review. And again, we want to think, if there are portions that we want to paste things into, right? If you wanted to paste a texture into this, a brick pavement or a pavement in perspective or something like that, do we set this up like so, or do we paint a really hot color onto that so that it makes it easier to bring it in, to paste it in? Those kinds of questions, right? So if I do this to this foreground element, it makes it a situation where I can paste a texture into it. Do you remember that from previous classes, where you paste a texture into something that's selected like that? Just makes it easier to do that. Otherwise, people will think you work for T-Mobile or something. But I always like pavement to be a little bit lighter than normal. I've been commenting that onto your concept boards, that pavement needs to be light, not dark, just because it creates different focus. But if we do want to paste something into this, sometimes we think strategically and start to put a hot color into here so that it makes it easier to paste into it. But for now, this is ready. So this is ready for export, so we'll go to Export 2D Graphic. We're gonna do Sample Perspective. Portable Network Graphic Options. We're gonna make it big again, so 6,000. Do a line scale multiplier of less than 1. I'm gonna stick with that half because I think I'm confident with how it's gonna look. I think. We'll see. Of half. I'll keep the anti-alias and transparent background on. I'll get that ready for export. And then I'll take a look at it. And we can see this is a nice soft white and gray with a non-sky background. So that's something we can definitely work with. Okay. So we've got our cutouts ready. We can close out SketchUp to save our RAM. We can close out Illustrator. We'll keep Photoshop open. I think we'll do this in Photoshop. kind of works either way, but I need to save my previous work. Get that out of the way. Close out Illustrator. And then open this new perspective document in Photoshop. So that is 5,000 pixels wide. There's no sky. So with that shaded with materials sample, we have the option, when we save it as a PNG, to not have a sky involved. This way we can place our own sky. So we'll start with a new sky. I thought we had a sky. Do we have one? The downloads. Put that there, and I can change the opacity down. Smoosh it, if you will. Put it into place. Start to put that as a focus. I may choose to have the entire sky or have it as a sort of a framed kind of view. Either way, I'll place it underneath. To rasterize it, manipulate it further, I may need to rasterize that layer. So if I right mouse click on the sky, I can rasterize it and I can manipulate it further. I can stretch it, I can skew it, I can continue to transform it. Holding down the Shift key, I can change the proportions of it. Used to be holding down the Shift key would preserve the proportions of a sky or an image, but now it's the other way around. So I'm going for sort of this, not as a total background, but holding down the Shift key, I can change the proportions of that sky, put that sort of there, so I'm starting a little bit of a framing element going. Just to save time, I'm going to bring in the same tree line from before. Because it will work. Ah, brilliant. Put it underneath. Not underneath the sky, but in between the sky and the buildings. Change its opacity. Something of that nature. Then I can start thinking about blending options. Blending options multiply starts to have an effect on some of the things it's working with. So it will have an effect with the sky. It'll work with the sky as opposed to against it, which could be interesting. You start to think about pulling the sky further, like so. Then if I bring in that tree line now, I can change its blending options. Under right mouse click on the layer, go to blending options, multiply, or darken, or burn, and it will start to work with the layers that are with it, like the sky. Different way of having it work with building up a certain type of transparency. Okay? So I cheated a little bit. This is the store site, so it is accurate to that, but it is looking a different way. I could also shorten that. I could flip it. There's some other things, but it is helpful to have a cutout from that site, because it is an accurate representation of what's happening on the site. But I may elect to have a different view there's one of you in there, right there, in fact. And kind of get that in position so it's accurate for the site itself. Then, if we go to Resources, Foregrounds, this is tree cutouts, car cutouts, diagramming elements, people, let me go back another one. I need to go to List View, just so I can, so backgrounds and foregrounds, fields and skies, here's a brick paver set we can download. Might do something with that in a moment. Fields and skies. These are from Thailand, so there are some interesting grasses that we can use as foreground elements. So there's green grass, stone road, a couple of night views, but they are high-resolution photographs, so they can be interesting settings by which we can place new things into them. But there are some foreground elements that might work for us. There's some foreground here that I think could work. So these wildflowers look interesting, so I might grab that. I'm going to open that new thing, green grass and sunset, and I'm going to grab the quick selection tool, fairly big, make it big, because this is a big image. So I make my selection tool bigger by adjusting its brush size. Holding down the Shift key, I'm just going to grab some of these wildflowers and start to create a foreground mask. How far to go. I have to be careful though, because the edge might be really, really gnarly. Copy that to the clipboard, make a new file. Background contents transparent. Create. Paste. There's my new foreground. And I might deal with this edge. This edge is kind of gnarly, so I'll pick a textured brush, either wet media or general brushes. This is a leafy thing, like so. And I will think about erasing part of that away. I need to pick this brush as an eraser head. This is a textured brush. Take a look and see what's loaded on your computers, just in terms of a textured brush. And you can start to delete away a portion of this edge so it's not as hard of an edge. This just preps the mask and starts to allow us to get us a little bit of softer edge as opposed to a hard edge to create that foreground feeling. I'll save this as a new file. I'll just call it, it's a PNG, it needs to be a portable network graphic, foreground wildflowers. Save that to one of the folders. Close that out. Close that out. It's saving, and I will think about placing it now into a foreground. Place, embedded, foreground wildflowers. Bring it in. This looks awful, Jesus. But it is, in principle, how we start to build up a foreground. Opacity and blending mode multiply. See the difference here? Color burn, burn, darker, lighten, screen, color dodge. There's different blending motions here where we can start to bring this in and have it be less severe of a foreground element. Help if I liked it. Dissolve, normal. But this can start to bring in a foreground element. So that it isn't just nothingness, right? We need some elements in the foreground, we need some landscape materials in the foreground, and we start to create some framing elements with that. We can place our friend the tree as well as a foreground element. That becomes part of it as well. Another strategy, perhaps. So we have our whiteout tree, place him or her into that foreground. Maybe he or she is up here. That becomes part of a strategy. Turn him or her around. Turn her opacity down so it's consistent. Come on, with the section. So those are some foreground elements. Foreground framing elements that help create interest and focus into the center of the drawing. So back to what Neil was talking about. This is the horizon line. This is the vanishing point. That's where all the things are converging. We can break this up into a rule of thirds. So that's where we put the interest stuff in. Just like your iPhone or Samsung phone frames out photographs, if we start to logically build up this perspective as a series of layers, then things start to magically converge around this composition based on where our eye wants things to be. So we can see some of these foreground elements, the beginnings of these framing elements, and the like. So let's grab some more stuff. Need to go up in the directory. Starting to get some good cars. Here's some textures. Oh, I did have some brick. So let's open up that brick. This was just a photo I took down at Canyon Commons. I can flip this horizontally, like so. I can select all of it. Start to push its perspective, grab the perspective and push it like this or like this. I want to start to think about it as a path. I don't want to push it too far because then it looks stupid, so we have to be careful. But more than likely, what we might do here is grab just a portion of it. And just, we might select part of this and grab this portion of it as a series of converging lines, like so. See how I'm respecting the herringbone structure of the brick and just copying that to a new thing. Background transparent. This is a new brick path, so we'll call that a brick path. That's part of our new cutout. Then we can place it in here. So we place it in our hierarchy, brick path. Is it not saved yet? It's being saved. Once again, working too fast for the computer. Close that out. Close that out. Brick path. Place. Now I can bring it in. Now I can think about stretching it, skewing it, distorting it into this new picture. Place it underneath things. Change my blending options. These are some of the things you can do as you start to bring this stuff in. I kind of like that. I'll copy it. And I'll use 2 copies of it. Hit enter. Flip that over. Start skewing this or distorting it more. That's a little tough. Not as much fun. Maybe pushing it too far. Usually tells you when it's going too far, but I can tuck it in underneath, start to do some things with it. Maybe this is a crosswalk or a drop-off point, something like that. Any number of things. Just with this skew command, there's so many things I can do with this. So maybe that's an extension, a drop-off point, a portion of a sidewalk, or a bump out or a bulb out. Crosswalks are easy. They're just you just lay bars. You create a series of bars and then you skew them down just so they appear as a crosswalk. But I can also copy this a couple of times and lay this together, and I can start to lay out a crosswalk as well. So there's a couple of strategies there just in terms of the collage that can start to delineate some different things. So those things all have their own layers. Let's grab some cars. Get a couple of cars in here. Cutouts. I grabbed a few yesterday. These are good for plans or sections. And then there's different cutouts for different drawings, whether they be for street sections or plans. And then there's obviously cars that are in perspective view, which are good for vanishing into perspective drawings like this. Scale that, flip it over, so it's going to the right place. Maybe change its opacity a little bit. Then think about some trees. More trees. I'm going to put those in front of in the back of the car. Get those in there. Change their opacity. Think about their blending options. Are those blended multiply? Are they blended normal? Those kinds of questions. You can experiment with that. You can see that when we use multiply, we don't cover up as much of the line work or the shadows of the buildings. That's a strategy to think about. We can use the tree more than once. We can flip it over. That's a strategy to think about. So if I place it here again, I go to Image, Transform, Flip Horizontal. It doesn't look as much as the other one. And if we alternate those, we can trick our viewer into thinking that they are in fact other trees. Or not. Sometimes I do that trick with the foreground element. I'll take a brush and I will gnaw away a portion of a tree to take part of it away and make it look like a brand new tree. But we can use these blending options to preserve the details of our architecture so that we're not covering everything up. That blending option is so important. And I'll place some people. So let's go to people cutouts. We have vector line people. That's a brand new pack. We have summer people. We have autumnal people. Ah, yes, autumnal. People dressed for the fall and winter. So we can start downloading some of these. Most of them are walking away from us. Now here's where we have to decide something. Are we using them as people fully dressed, or are we using them as silhouettes? Those are decisions to be made now, because if not, we can make silhouettes or we can place them in. Based on our composition, our compositional guides, we place the people according to our compositional guides in rule of thirds. In my downloads menu, just start bringing people in. They're pretty good resolution, so I bring them down to the horizon line. Put their eye level at the horizon line, wherever they happen to be. I'll put them in front, put them underneath the foreground elements. I'll turn their opacity down. Oops, too far. Place my next person. Lots of people looking at their phones these days. Put her at or near the horizon line. Put her in front of the car. Or put the car behind her. Play with their opacity. Okay, getting there. Reasonably happy with that result. Is that starting to look like something? Maybe. Let's get a few more grasses in here. Go back to trees. We have some grasses in the tree cutouts. We have some shrubbery. So we've got this clump here. That's useful for us. Has to be placed in the hierarchy so that it's in a reasonable spot. These can be strategic because they can cover up things that we don't know or have not resolved. Like that. Brilliant. Brilliant, Deeg. And I can change the blending options so they can be multiplied. And we'll work with the context a little bit, and I can resolve my unresolved brick path. Maybe deal with that a little bit. That looks a little better. I don't use multiply on this one. Maybe I just use normal on that. All right, that's starting to look like something. And then I can start to doctor things. Maybe this path is going through those shrubs. I can erase that portion away. In order to modify that cutout, though, I have to rasterize the layer. Very important. And then I can start to cut away portions of that layer. Just like we did before. Might be with this brush, or it might be with something else. But at any rate. Blending of foreground, middle ground, and background. I can take these grasses, copy them, and paste them a couple of times, place them in different places to create some middle ground elements behind the car, maybe finish out this lawn. So I can just strategically tuck that in there. It starts to fill out the right side of the frame. And then finally, underneath all of that, underneath all the people and the cutouts, I'm going to make a shadow layer. Oops. Don't want to export yet. Just to finish this out, between the cutouts and the paths, I'm going to make a shadow layer. Shadows. Now normally, if I had a lot of time, I would make shadows of every single cutout. Cast them from the person, cast them from a tree. Well, to save time, rather than doing all that, what we can do is just grab a brush, a soft brush, big brush, adjust the flow and the smoothing of it so that it acts more as an airbrush. Pick a soft gray or soft purple gray and just paint in some shadows underneath the car, underneath these people, casting away from them, casting underneath these trees. Like that. This layer has to be in the right place, though. It really does. So I'm going to change its blending options to multiply. So that way, see how that's a translucent gray now, not an opaque gray, but it's got to be in the right place. So I've got to move it probably on top of my layer 1, or on top of my brick path. There. All right. So I got my shadows in here. I painted them in. This is the car. These are the trees, the houses, the people walking. And that looks terrible. So what I'll do now is blur these shadows. I'll do a motion blur. And get a preview here. And just blur these shadows out significantly. See that? See what that does? It softens the shadows so they don't look like a dumb shape. See what that does? It just softens them out. Now the car looks like it's casting a shadow. Now the people look like they're casting shadow, but the shadow is not a recognizable shape. It gives just enough to give the impression of the trees, people, and cars casting shadows onto that surface. Okay? Anything else that's missing from this? In your opinion? What do you think? I need a little bit of softer gray. I'm going to put in an asphalt layer and just put in a soft gray for that. I need that in my life. I've been commenting that a lot of your asphalt is too dark, but I need just a little bit more gray here, just because it's a gray September day. Close that up. And then I'll take my paint bucket, find a soft gray in here. I can do this as a gradient, or I can just do it as a touch, and that's just enough. That's my Bob Ross moment right there, just enough. Drill in that opacity. See how it sits underneath those shadows? Man, does that look nice. Deeg's happy again. Birds are singing. It's raining. There it is. What do you think? Is that a workflow? Is that a method that can work for you? Using the cutouts, using blending techniques, using layers. Okay. Paper rendering like this, file management and file types are so important. When you finish this layer hierarchy, you may want to move things around or change stuff out. Save it as PSD file, Photoshop document. Preserves all of the layers in their existing hierarchy. You can start merging and grouping layers too if you want. Put all the trees together, put all the paving together, whatever. But before you move forward, always save this as a Photoshop document so all of your layers are intact. You can also save it as a TIFF. It will save the layers. Why? If you ever need to come back to this, you can come back to it and change things. Okay? So let's do that first. Save that. So I'm going to save that as a PSD file. You can save it as a PSD or a TIFF. I want to make sure this is checked, layers. It will preserve all the layers as is. It's going to be a very big file, but that's life. Okay. This is a multi-million-dollar development, so it's okay. Then, if I want to preserve the transparency of the sky, I will save a copy of this as a PNG. That will preserve the transparency. See that checkerboard back there? That means that the opacity of the sky is very thin. So that will preserve the transparency of the edges and of the sky itself. Save it as a PNG. You notice that the layers are turned off. It will take all the layer structure as it is and make a single layer out of it. Save. I want to make sure this is a different file name. And you can say large, medium, or small. Just for giggles, I'll save it as a JPEG as well. It takes a minute to save that. Do you understand the importance of the different file types? PSD preserves all the layer structure. The first PNG is going to compress all the layers together into the current structure. However, PNG will preserve the opacity or translucency of any elements or layers that are translucent. It's still saving, but we're using a lot of RAM. Then, once those two things are saved, you could potentially flatten the image, and that will flatten all the layers together. Look what the sky looks like now. It's now flattened against a white background. At this point, you could continue to doctor it further. We could add a texture to this to make it a textured look, or put it through a filter. And sometimes we there are, I mean, some folks like the watercolor filter, there are some aspects to it that are interesting, the colored pencil filter, the cutout filter. It adds a certain abstraction to the artwork. This will give you a preview. The watercolor filter, I use it, I think it's interesting because it can bring in a lot of different elements from different cutouts and unify them. Kind of like baking a cake, okay? So, you know, if you want all these flavors to be together, what it does, it just kind of hardens everything a little bit if you put everything through a filter. Some folks like that, some folks, nah, don't need it, but it can bring in elements. You can see these trees, you can see through them, but they're kind of hardened and baked into their textures into the background. And it can bring in diverse cutouts that don't look like they were from different sources. The watercolor filter kind of makes everything look like it came from the same place. So some folks like that. Try it out. It's not for everybody. But then this would become an image that we would save as a JPEG, a flattened JPEG, or a flattened PNG. Either way, it's still a big file, but it's a completely flattened image now that you can then put into a PowerPoint, put into an email, put onto the front cover of your document, whatever. So I will say that in the file name that it's flattened, and I will say that it's filtered, just so I can remember what I did to it. Okay? So those are ways of finishing out the document, preserving a layer structure and then preserving transparency, or putting it through a filter to make it all kind of look like it belongs together. Because when you're using diverse cutouts, sometimes the cutouts don't look like they're from the same family. Sunny day, cloudy day. You put all those cutouts together, sometimes they don't match well. You put it through a filter, it kind of bakes it all together as one big cake. And then you can structure your presentation around this color structure. So if you go to Adobe Color Wheel, like we did before, you can build your whole presentation color scheme around this rendering. Bright, muted, deep, dark, none. Muted. You could build the whole structure of your presentation, either your PowerPoint or your document or your storyboard around the colors in your $1 million rendering. That way your presentation looks consistent all the way through. So this is a custom color scheme now built off of some of the key points in this rendering. And you can move them around. And to the point where, you know, let the algorithm do it, and you can save this to your Adobe ID, or you can copy these to the clipboard, bring them into your color swatches, take a screenshot of this as reference, whatever. Now you have a color scheme that you can build up your presentation in other Adobe products around this one rendering. Okay?